Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers and Share My Lesson, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Refugee Crisis, Connecting the Past with Today. My name is Tamika Childs, and I am an AFT e-learning coordinator, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Esther Herr, with Echoes and Reflections. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you. This is Esther Herr. I'm a trainer for Echoes and Reflections. I want to first thank Tamika and Amy, the people behind Share My Lessons and AFT at Large, for allowing me to present to you this webinar entitled The Refugee Crisis, Connecting the Past with Today. And as Tamika encouraged us earlier on, please go ahead and use that group chat to introduce each other. I already noticed that people are making friends, which is fantastic. I saw some folks from Pittsburgh. That's where I grew up, so real glad to see Pittsburgh being represented there. So let me say a little bit about Echoes and Reflections before I continue on with the core of our webinar. So as many of you know, Echoes and Reflections provides digital resources and lesson plans to secondary educators to help them teach about the Holocaust in responsible and effective ways. Both to teach as a historical event, as well as a human story. And at the core of our offerings, we have 11 thematic units, such as the rise of Nazi Germany, the ghettos, the final solution, the resistance, and rescuers. But this particular webinar is going to be focusing on a particular focus here called the Jewish refugee experience during the 1930s. And we're going to focus on some of the many resources that you can find in Echoes and Reflections that connect folks to this particular narrative. And so in addition to highlighting these resources, I'm also going to identify connection points to the current crisis, because the benefit of learning about history is really our ability to apply these lessons to how we understand our situation today. Now, the resources that I've mentioned can be found in our Echoes and Reflections website. And you'll see here the screenshot of our website. Notice that you don't have to sign in or anything. It is totally freely accessible to you. Now, notice on the top you see that red circle there that says Teach. That is, if you click on that, that is where you're going to find those 11 units, and embedded in those 11 units, you're going to find all those different lesson plans and resources. Later on, you'll see what that looks like as we continue forward. But first and foremost, let's get a sense of who is in this webinar. So just to get a pulse check here, you've got these 5 different options here as it relates to how you're able to engage your students, young people, on this particular topic. So the first one is, do you teach a Holocaust-centered or genocide class? Do you teach about the Holocaust in a meaningful way as part of a World War II unit? Do you teach about the Holocaust for 1 or 2 class periods? Do you touch on the Holocaust, or do you not teach about the Holocaust at all? And this is a question not about like interest, but rather just like a pulse check of when and how it's being taught. So I'll give you a few seconds to make some choices there as it relates to this question. And again, it's not a reflection about your passion or interest. It's just kind of your realities, what you're dealing with right now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and see how we did in terms of our polling results here. Okay, so it's interesting to see how it's broken up pretty evenly here. The majority of you actually are not able to or cannot teach about the Holocaust at 26%, following that there is some level of talking about the Holocaust in a variety of different ways. And that's good information for me, because I'm hoping that through identifying some of these resources, you can consider, for those who haven't had the opportunity to think about how you can weave that into what you are teaching today. Let's move on to the second polling question. And this is more specific to your students' feelings towards refugees. So in general, in general, how would you describe your students' feelings about today's refugees? And they can be all over the map, so that's why you have here up to three words that you can choose from. So just to the best of your abilities, how you're gauging this. Hostility, fear, feeling frustrated, indifferent, or curious, empathetic, welcoming, supportive, any of those kinds of words. Click on those, up to three words. I'll give you a few more seconds to consider that. Okay, so if you haven't already, just click on at least one word. I'm going to go ahead and move our slide to see what our results are. Okay, so as you can see, it's nice to see that the kind of the feelings, if you will, are geared more towards the end of this idea of supportive and empathetic. I love the fact that we've got quite a few folks that are saying curious. We also recognize that for some students, it is kind of bringing up issues of hostility and fear, and even indifference. And so that's a really interesting understanding for us as we approach this work, as we approach our conversations related to the refugee experience, then as well as today. So thank you for participating in that. So let me go ahead and start with all of these things in mind. I want to go ahead and start talking about refugee crisis today using history, using the Holocaust as a way we can ground that understanding and on-ramping the conversation for today. So certainly, as you know, with so much media attention about the humanitarian and national security issues along the U.S.-Mexican border, we are well aware of the continuing displaced persons crisis that actually first came up in 2016 with these news reports proclaiming that the global displacement person numbers have exceeded those not seen since World War II. So let's go back and consider what these news reports were referring to. So in World War II, they identified about 60 million displaced persons during and post-war, and more specifically, at the end of the war, they noted 7 to 9 million displaced persons there. Before we continue, I want to provide some clarity with terms because a lot of people use, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, displaced persons interchangeably, and they do have very specific meanings. So I'm going to be quick, but hopefully it's succinct enough for you to understand the distinctions. So here we have refugees, someone who's been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. So this is all about somebody leaving their country because of fear of persecution, okay? We have a term that's somewhat similar, asylum seeker, and I'll let you read this definition here. I think the distinction, though, made between refugees and asylum seekers, and if you can kind of use your imagination for a second, refugees are those that are in these refugee camps, right? They have left their country and they have found themselves in these particular refugee camps. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, are folks who have left their country and have gone to the country that they're seeking safety. This is very different, right? Because asylum seekers can, people who come to the U.S. border, for example, and say that they're seeking asylum, they have to go through a particular process, in the case for our country, a court system, to determine whether or not they have refugee status, if they are fleeing because of a well-founded fear of violence, war, or persecution. Okay, if the court finds that their claim is not because of that fear of persecution, war, violence, then they are taken back to their country. So that's just the distinction I want to make between the two. A third distinction I want to make is internally displaced persons. Now, displaced peoples, let me back up, it's this overarching term made up of these three groups in general, refugees, asylum seekers. And the third one is internally displaced persons. Now, as you can see in the definition here, there are a variety of reasons why people flee or leave their home or place of habitual residence, as written here, and not just exclusively related to war or persecution, but things like natural or human-made disasters, things of that sort. Another element internally displaced persons are that makes them distinct from the others is the fact that they actually don't leave their country's boundaries. They stay within country. Okay? So again, terminology, you know this so well, very crucial in communicating and understanding these issues. Okay? So given that clarity, I want to move on to the refugee crisis as I shared earlier. So going back to the numbers, 2015, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, or also known as the UN Refugee Agency, who is in charge of keeping these numbers, they found that 65.3 million displaced persons, they counted that many. And that number doesn't go up. Same with if you just isolated refugees and asylum seekers, you see that number continues to go up. 2018 numbers should be coming out sometime in early summer. That's why we don't have those numbers there. But as you can see, it's not, the refugee crisis continues to escalate in these very high numbers. Now, Ban Ki-moon, who was the former UN Secretary General, quoted as saying here, "We are facing the biggest refugee and displacement crisis of our time. Above all, this is not a crisis of numbers, it's a crisis of solidarity." And I really appreciate that last aspect of his quote here, because yes, we see these numbers, they're extraordinary numbers. And we have to kind of think about how is the global society responding to these numbers. So let's consider, for example, what he means by crisis of solidarity. So back in 2015, November 2015, there was a Paris attack that left 130 people dead. ISIS claimed responsibility. It's important to note that the attackers were all EU citizens. And while there was a Syrian passport in one of the scenes, it was later found to be fake. Nonetheless, the fear that terrorists would be among refugees, Syrian refugees entering the U.S. dominated the words and actions among many people, including politicians. So in the words of the former U.S. House Speaker Paul Ryan, he wrote, "We cannot allow terrorists to take advantage of compassion. This is a moment where it's better to be safe than sorry." You see here the tension between national security, which is a very important thing, as well as humanitarian actions here. Interestingly, consider this quote by FDR. This is during the Holocaust. Now, of course, the refugee has got to be checked because, unfortunately, among the refugees, there are some spies. Now, both their words speak to the interest in security, as I said before. We know with FDR that fear, which is informed by the State Department, focused on barring Jewish refugees from coming over, that fear was misplaced. It far outweighed the reality. And so said many people during that time, and certainly said in hindsight as well. Another thing that I want us to think about to kind of contextualize this webinar is the fact that when we talk about the crisis, the international response to the refugee crisis, we cannot forget who is at the center of this all. And these are the refugees themselves. Consider these two quotes here. I'll give you a second just to read it on your own. Notice the similarities in their quotes here. We have one on the left, a Jewish refugee, a Holocaust survivor, thanks to the kinder transport. You have Aline, a Burundian refugee. Despite time, circumstances, geography, we have this theme that you see with these two folks, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of loss, and being at the mercy of others, and hoping for help and understanding their good intentions. So regardless of the time and space, we notice that the refugee story has these really salient themes. So as educators, our role is to teach content, but obviously, as you know, that's not the only thing. And certainly in the case of the Holocaust, it's also to provide us with lessons to help us understand today, understanding the refugee crisis specifically for this webinar. How can our students make sense of the genocide and the refugee crisis today? How can we use the Holocaust to help them make sense of it all? So my hope is that the materials that I will be identifying can help you begin to make those connections. The last one I want to highlight, which is really important, is that the refugee crisis of the 30s and today is not a one-to-one exact thing. Rather, what I'm trying to say here is that the refugee crisis, a Jewish refugee experience, can serve as a cautionary tale of indifference, intolerance, and inaction. Again, my hope is to help you make these connections to on-ramp, if you will, the conversation from the Holocaust to today's refugee crisis. So let's go ahead and delve into some of those materials in Echoes. Again, just highlighting a few of many of the materials that you can use to help your students better understand and appreciate the challenges faced by Jewish, German Jewish refugees. And so interesting, I want to start with this particular question. This may be a question that some of you have heard from your students directly or indirectly. What are some of your students' assumptions when they ask, why didn't the Jews leave Germany and or Europe? So what I'd like for you to do now is take a moment to type some of your thoughts about that in the chat box. Now, just to clarify, what I'm looking for is the assumption behind the question. I'm not asking why they couldn't or didn't leave. Rather, I'm asking what are some of the assumptions that your students have when they ask this question. So again, just real quick, shorthand in the group chat, if you can type a few of those things. What are some of those assumptions behind that question? Why didn't the Jews leave Germany and or Europe? So, and I'm only going to be able to read just a few posts, and in no way am I saying that the others don't deserve acknowledgement, but I think you can understand that there's so many great things out there. I encourage you to continue to group chat, while this webinar is taking place. I want to read Colleen, since hers was the first. They think there was a clear evidence of what Nazis were up to, and they had the resource and freedom to network and move out. Another one is students typically believe that Jews were allowed to leave and choose not to. And then another one said they assumed that everyone was healthy enough to leave. All assumptions that they're bringing to the conversation, which I appreciate. So thinking about some of those assumptions, I think it's really helpful to begin to unpack that question and actually challenging them in considering that question for a moment. So what I want to, I'm sorry, and then also I noticed that in the Q&A, thank you, Amy, she's our tech person in the background here. Students can't figure out why the Jewish community didn't just shoot their way out. And another one, the assumption is that it is easy to go from country to country. They don't know the process and paperwork involved. Exactly. All the things that you're talking about are these assumptions. And let me be really clear. Our young people are viewing history through a U.S.-centric, 21st century, young person lens. So, there's still so much more of the world. And so we need to be mindful of where they're coming from and why they're asking these questions in order to begin to unpack it and begin to teach, in this specific case, about the Jewish refugee crisis then. So thank you for your response, and obviously continue to add to that group chat. So I actually want to start responding to this question, or unpacking or challenging maybe the assumptions behind this question, by first exploring how difficult it was for them to leave the country. by first considering life for Jewish Germans before 1933. And I do this because I feel like it's important to consider what life was like before these history-altering events in order to appreciate what was lost during and then afterwards. And for those who are familiar with what life was like for Jews living in Germany before 1933, so many of them said that they were German first, Jewish second. Now that doesn't mean that they denied their Jewish identity by any means, rather that they were very much feeling like they were a part of the country. And there was for good reason. Germany at that time was considered a highly civilized, highly cultured country. Jews, and even though anti-Semitism did exist in Europe, I don't want to deny that, but rather that they were able to live full lives in this country. They spoke German. They were fully integrated in social and economic life of Germany. There were generations and generations of Jewish Germans living there, and many fought for Germany during World War I. Basically, they embraced the German way of life. Now, as many of you know, 1933 was a pivotal year. Hitler was appointed chancellor, and everything changed with the anti-Jewish policy that was put into place to isolate Jewish Germans from the general public in many ways, economically, socially, educationally, physically, and even emotionally. Interestingly, this policy can also be thought of as Germany's forced emigration policy. Now, this is explored in our website, specifically in our lesson plan, or our unit, called Nazi Germany. And that's what that looks like there. And if you were to scroll down, you will find a lesson plan specifically related to anti-Jewish policies in the 1930s Germany. And to the main area, you see the lesson, and then on the right-hand side, you see the particular primary and secondary resources that we have. So I'm going to actually start us out with Herman Cohn as a way to begin to answer this question. So as you can see with all of our videos, we have these very short clips. They've been curated to try to match up with the kind of the learning that you're hoping that your students get out of. And also you can see a little blurb about who these interviewees are, giving context. And really quickly, Herman Cohn was born September 8, 1921 in Germany. He did not experience life in the ghettos or the concentration camps. Rather, he fled to the Netherlands and then was able to reunite with his parents, and then they went to the United States. And when the war began, Herman was 17 years old. So let's take a listen to what he says about life after 1933. And as you listen to it, I want you to think about specifically that question. How did life change? What does he say about life as a German Jew after 1933? Here we go.
I think we children felt it more acutely because of the harassment that we received almost on a daily basis in school and on the street, and on a different level than the parents. The parents thought initially that this would blow over, you see, until more and more laws, where the Nuremberg laws and other laws were introduced, which made it more difficult. We couldn't have the same maid in the household anymore. We couldn't buy in certain stores anymore. We couldn't go to a swimming pool anymore. We couldn't go into parks anymore. When all of these laws were introduced, we really felt it more and more year after.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted as I was saying some wonderfully insightful words there. Sorry about that, folks. Thank you, Amy, as always. I was just inviting you to go ahead and respond to the question, what does Herman say about life as a German Jew after 1933? Why don't you go ahead and type in your thoughts in the group chat. Okay, I see here hopeless and frightened. It was almost as if they could never recognize their lives or their country anymore. Another says, Laura says, so many parts of life to be banned from. Colleen writes, more and more restrictions put into laws, adults do not see it as urgently as children who were bullied. Okay, so it's an interesting contrast, right, about the experience of that anti-Jewish or forced immigration policy. And continue, please, to add to that group chat. I did want to isolate that piece, though, that was mentioned about, him saying that the parents thought it would all blow over. And, I want to make it really clear. It's so obvious, and yet I feel obligated to say it. We know how the story ends. They didn't. So I think it is reasonable to consider that, yes, it's bad, but it just can't get any worse. Common sense will prevail. The pendulum will swing back. It's gonna be okay. We just have to kind of hunker down and just address it the best we can and move forward. Because don't forget, Germany was their home country. What reason would they want to leave to a different country speaking in a different language, different way of life? Yeah, that's a scary proposition to consider. So I think we have to consider the reasonable nature of thinking that this will all blow over. We know, our hindsight, 2020, that was not the case. But at the time, living in that moment, thinking we can tolerate this, things will get better. So with that said, though, let's just be clear that there were some folks who did leave. So in 1933, about 37,000 to 38,000 had left Germany. And that number stays fairly stable, dips a little bit, and then we get to 1938. Now, 1938 was a very faithful year. You notice that in this slide, you see I wrote 36,000 left Germany and Austria. As you may know, there was the Anschluss with the annexation of Austria in March. More pivotal was November 9th and 10th with Kristallnacht. This was a government-sponsored and sanctioned program against Jews all over Germany. This resulted in 7,000 Jewish businesses and homes looted, 1,400 synagogues burned down, cemeteries and schools vandalized, and over 30,000 Jews, mostly men, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. This event made it very clear to Jews that they were no longer welcome in Germany. So when we look at our stats from 1939, we see here more than double, 77,000 left Germany and Austria. So getting back to that question, why did the Jews leave Germany? On one hand, they thought it will blow over. They thought they can endure. And at the same time, there were those who did leave. They wanted to leave. And you can see in 39 in significant numbers. Now, let me switch gears here because I want to try to create that on-ramp refugee crisis of today. Now, most recently, we've heard that the number of migrant families crossing the southern border have broken another record with 2 times the numbers of what they call unauthorized entries, doubling from last year. So in February alone, it's been reported that 76,000 crossings happened at the border. This is an 11-year high. Now, what I've read is that many people, migrants, because migrants is a very generic term, okay, remember our terminology here, that many of them have voluntarily surrendered and later submitted their legal asylum claims, okay? So again, they are asylum seekers, okay? Again, claims that are about persecution and violence and the like. We are seeing this a lot here now. But this is not a recent trend. Several years back, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of reports of Central American refugees and asylum seekers. As you can see here, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, fleeing gang violence. So let's take a look at those numbers. So in 2012, there were nearly 21,000 U.S. cases from these folks from these 3 countries alone, also called the Northern Triangle, considered one of the highest murder countries in the world. You see the 2012, you have that 21,000. Look at how high that jumps in about 3 years' time. nearly 110,000 U.S. cases. Okay? So when the Obama administration recognized the pressing need, and they announced the expansion of its refugee program to admit Central American refugees in 2016, many denounced this move, including this one representative who said the Obama administration has decided to blow wide open any small discretion it has in order to reward individuals who have no lawful presence in the U.S. with the ability to bring their family members here. Now, you can unpack this quote in many different ways. I'm going to just isolate it to the word reward individual and no lawful presence, okay? It is suggesting, this person is suggesting that people are wanting to come to the United States because of the pool of citizenship and of a better life, quote unquote. And usually it's couched in terms of economic life. Okay? It is the pool of citizenship. However, if you speak to refugees themselves, you'll hear a very different story. There are real issues, as many you know, in Central America, overrun by gangs and violence. Men and boys being forced to do what the gangs are asking them to do. Otherwise, they would be murdered. Girls and women are being, are experiencing violence, sexual violence on their own in that respect. So we cannot deny that there are some terrible things that are happening here. So here's a quote from one particular asylum seeker. "It was never my thinking to leave my country." She is from El Salvador, a widow because her husband was murdered because of gangs. Another one, a Honduran husband and father, said, "You don't migrate now in search of the American dream. You go for your life." The reason why he left was because he was threatened that if he didn't participate in the gang activity, join the gangs, he would be murdered. So what does this mean for us? What's the on-ramping? What's the connection here? So the story of the Jewish Germans and the Central American refugees help us remember a key basic point. People don't want to be refugees. So simple, and yet we forget that, right? They want to stay in their home country. They love their country, their language, their lives, the generations that live there. They're not migrants trying to get to the United States to better their lives economically or educationally or the like, but they're trying to get out of their country to save their lives because of persecution, war, and violence. There is a push factor, and it is to save their lives. Okay? So we focused on that theme about connection to country and the reasonable idea of it not getting worse. And we also know, too, that many did try to leave all the same. And when they did try to leave, they found themselves faced with bureaucratic challenges. It wasn't simply you packed your suitcase, you get a ticket for a ship or a train, and you can leave to safety. So to illustrate this point, I want to show you another resource. So I'm going to go to our unit called Perpetrators, Collaborators, and Bystanders. And if you scroll down, you're going to see another video testimony by Liesl Loeb here. I'm going to quickly identify who she is here. She was born June 17, 1928 in Germany and did not experience life in the ghettos or concentration camps. And she fled to the UK and then later to the United States. And so when the war began, she was 11 years old. Now, she is going to speak about one of the many challenges that folks face when they try to leave Germany entering into another country. So as you listen to her testimony, I'd like for you to consider the question, what does she say that speaks to that challenge? What does she say to speak to the challenges of refugees, especially, in her case, getting into the United States?
It was a very complicated matter to do this. First of all, the American consulates had been instructed, as we now know, not to make it too easy for Jews to enter the United States. And since the German quota for immigration into the States at that time was 25,000 per year, 25,000 people per year. And the government made no allowances borrowing from other quotas. That was it. And we now also have found out that those quotas were never even filled, even though at that time we didn't know it. There was such an onslaught for requests that then the consulates issued numbers. First come, first served numbers, like in a delicatessen store. This was never an official announcement. It spread over Germany by word of mouth. I know my parents had friends, with whom they got together regularly, who by a very casual conversation said, there is now a quota system. You have to get numbers before you can go to the consulate. Our consulate was in Stuttgart. You have to apply for a number. And immediately my mother would call up her sister in Berlin and say, listen, you've got to get a number. My parents had a fairly low number. It was, I have the documentation. It was in the 14,000s. That was considered a low number. By the time her sister was able to get to a consulate and get a number, they were in the 70,000s. And that was like a condemnation to death.
Okay, folks. So again, if you could go back to your chat box, please, and respond to this question. How does Liesel's testimony speak to the challenges of refugees? There's maybe some phrases that you heard her say that really struck you that highlight that challenge. So Elizabeth writes, there was this unwritten policy not to make things easy. Thank you for that. And as you rightly said, the limited public charge clause was very much a part of that kind of ability to have that wiggle room, if you will, right? Government making no allowances. Thank you for that. Having to wait for a number, right? I'm sure you heard, like a delicatessen store, like what an image to bring up, right? This sense of like having to wait in line and the number of people in front of you. This, folks, is really about the quota system. And this is just one of many challenges they face. I'm just highlighting it in one particular aspect. Let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So when she talks about the availability of visas, note, 1938, 125,000 applicants for 27,000 visas, 27,000 visas meaning from Germany and Austria. Remember, they are now combined now. Notice, so less than a year later, 300,000 applicants. Notice the number of visas still available, 27,000. Folks, there was no refugee program during this time. People who are trying to get out of Germany and Austria, they were in the immigration process like so many other people, regardless of the context of why they needed to get out, why they wanted to get out. So this was a challenge there, as well as just the whole entire visa process. So definitely, again, why didn't the Jews leave Germany, for example? The question. Here's another way to respond to that question. Now, I want to quickly, because I noticed the time here, I want to highlight a very important resource, the UN refugee agencies I mentioned before. They're the ones in terms of resettling refugees to help us get them resettled in a variety of countries, including the United States. And it's actually a very lengthy process. And what a lot of people don't realize is that it is the UN that vets refugees. It's not the United States. They are the first to vet, to screen these refugees, and then they refer to the United States. Refugees, by the way, have no say in what country they want to go. The process takes 18 to 24 months, they say, but it's been known to take 4 to 5 years. And about 50% of those who usually been referred to by the agency can successfully complete that process. And what does that process look like? 8 U.S. government agencies, 6 separate databases, 5 background checks, and 3 in-person interviews. Now, this is a really rigorous and lengthy process, and it is good that acknowledging that a refugee program needed to happen, and that was created after the Holocaust, after World War II. But nonetheless, you can see it is still a highly rigorous and difficult process to get through. Less than 1% of refugees are ever resettled. Now, in terms of the refugee admittance cap, it doesn't guarantee, just as Lisa mentioned, there's no guarantee that all the slots will be filled. For the 2019 year, they're capping it at 30,000. This is the lowest ever since the United States created a modern refugee program, as you can see here in the chart. Furthermore, as I mentioned before, there's no obligation to meet the 30,000 cap. Last year, they capped it at 45,000, but they only admitted about 21,000. So let's continue on to consider what further helps us understand the refugee crisis, and I want to highlight one more resource here, the MS St. Louis. In May 13, 1939, 937 passengers, mostly Jewish, were aboard the MS St. Louis bound to Cuba from Hamburg. And many were able to secure landing certificates to allow them to stay in Cuba while awaiting their turn in the quota process. So they made it. They made it through the process. And now they're just waiting. Now, these certificates are officially free, but the Cuban Director of Immigration took money from them. So you have here suddenly now a convergence of factors: infighting, greed, anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-Semitism that changed an other ordinary process of disembarking in Havana. And many on the boat were denied entry when they reached the country in May 27. So let's listen to Sol Messinger, who is also found in the same unit, and there he is. He was born June 16, 1932 in Berlin, and was imprisoned in Agde internment camp in France, and then was able to get to the United States. He was 7 when the war began. Very young person. So let's consider his experience while he was on the MS St. Louis.
We arrived in Havana, Cuba, on the 27th of May. I remember it because it was my mother's 34th birthday, the 27th. And, but there had been, I don't know, there was some disquiet among some of the passengers. Apparently there had been rumors towards the end of the trip that there were going to be problems. Don't ask me how those rumors started or why they started. I have no idea. But there was a certain disquiet, and of course, children feel this. And I realized that there was some, I don't know, it wasn't the way it was at the beginning of the trip. And this was accentuated because we didn't actually dock at a pier in Havana Harbor. We just stayed in the harbor. And, people started saying, well, why aren't we docking? Well, at first they said, well, we can't dock until morning. I believe it was a Friday evening. Anyway, the next morning, the 28th of May, we didn't dock again. And then I don't know exactly when it came out, but we were told that the visas which had been issued to the passengers on the St. Louis had been declared invalid. Well, pandemonium broke loose in the ship. I just remember some scenes vaguely, but I remember my parents being extremely upset. My mother was crying, you can imagine. And of course, because my parents and everybody else was upset, I was upset, and I understood. I understood that we might not be able to get off the boat. Of course, many of these people on the boat had relatives in Cuba already. And so what these relatives started doing was they hired these little fishing boats. And these fishing boats started sailing around the ship, trying to find, get a glimpse of their relatives. And that's where I learned my first Spanish word, which was mañana. Everybody was yelling mañana, which meant, of course, tomorrow. Tomorrow, you'll disembark, tomorrow. It was a scene, a real scene. All these fishing boats, just circling around. a week later, I believe it was on the 31st, no, it was June 1st, I think, we started sailing out of Havana Harbor. I don't know if you can imagine what people felt. I mean, here we were, we had left Germany where it was so terrible, and here we were, you know, a few hundred feet away from safety, and we weren't being allowed to land there. Well, you know, there was the mood on the ship was horrible, and people did threaten to commit suicide, and so the captain apparently told this committee, the passengers, that what he would do was not sail directly back to back to Hamburg, but that he would sail along the coast of Florida, and while more negotiations were going on with Cuba, so that maybe Cuba would change its mind and we could just go back there, and also that we could make representations by telegram and so on, and to the United States government, as well as other governments in the Western Hemisphere. Certainly, the Jewish groups in the United States and Europe continued to try to find some place for us to go besides going back to Germany. And indeed, I think it was 2 days or 1 day before we were actually supposed to land in Hamburg that we got word that 4 countries had agreed to split up the passengers on the ship, on the St. Louis, and those 4 countries were England, France.
Okay, so really powerful testimony about his experience. Oops, sorry, is the end of St. Louis. So at this point, unfortunately, my enthusiasm got the better of me, and I need to actually begin to close the session. My hope, though, is that you've gotten some ideas about how you can start to thread you know, the idea of the Jewish refugee crisis, how we can use that as a teachable tool to understand today's crisis. And so with that, I want to go ahead and leave some time left for questions.
Great, and thank you, Esther, so much for such an amazing presentation. I'd like to ask everyone who has questions to go now to that Q&A widget at the bottom of the screen, that little purple square, and type in any questions that you have. Also, you should be able to download your professional development certificate right now if you answered the poll questions in this webinar, and you can click on the professional development button to do that. It's best to do that now before you log out of the session, but remember you must be on a laptop or desktop to access this certificate. So Esther, we're going to get started with some questions that have come in. One of the first ones is, what ages do you recommend are the best ages to start talking to your students about the connections between the Holocaust and the current refugee situation?
Oh, wow. I would say anytime. You know, I have a 10-year-old, and we talk about this. And, of course, we have to be age-appropriate in our language and how much we do share about these things. But there are so many great children's books out there that talk about this stuff. One in particular I'm thinking about is called The Journey. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but it's a wonderful storybook with these beautiful pictures about a family that's fleeing country because of fear of violence and coming here. For some of our kind of middle school age folks, you know, there's this book called The Refugee that actually what's so great about that one is that it is actually 3 stories in one. It's about a Jewish boy in the 30s. It's about a Syrian refugee, and it's about a Cuban refugee. And you see the author, Alan Gratz, G-R-A-T-Z, weaving their stories together and finding these common threads. It's a great book, so I highly recommend that.
Great. And are there any other opportunities that people will have to learn more about the Holocaust using Echoes and Reflections?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a great opportunity to highlight that in that same website. We have not only these webinars, again, thanks to the folks that share my lessons, but also we do these other webinars that are 1 hour long. We also have professional development face-to-face. So if you click on the Prepare section of our website, you're going to see all these different opportunities, and as well as some calendars, a calendar rather, that identifies where we're doing it, and they are all free, by the way, that you don't have to pay unless the host is paying for it, but we come in with no expectations of receiving any money.